This morning, I want to talk to you about this question: for what did Jesus die? And for whom did Jesus die? We're going to read Mark chapter 15 together. And in this chapter, we're going to read about the death of Jesus. Now, we are, as Jen pointed out, we are embarking in Holy Week. Today is Palm Sunday. We have Good Friday coming up in just a few days, followed by Easter. And I just want to kind of add to the challenge that over the course of this week, sometimes it's not as intuitive as maybe during Christmas, when we're reminded that, Christmas is a time for us to slow down, to pause, to just kind of like take a deep breath and relish in the time of gathering with family and friends at the various places that we find ourselves. But this is another one of those weeks, and yet it might not just come automatically to us because, most of us are going to work all week long, right? And there's not the Christmas Eve and the day leading up to Christmas Eve and just kind of the soft entry into the Christmas holiday. We largely, most of us have kind of a regular week, and then the weekend is upon us, and then just like that, it's over. But I want to encourage you to pause, to read, to reflect, to just think about and to take in all of the significance of what this week means. We do, of course, we believe that the significance of this week is something we carry with us throughout the year, right? The reality of and the significance of the cross and the meaning and the effect of the resurrection, all of those things have long-lasting impacts that take us well beyond this week. But let's try as a church, as followers of Jesus, to just really try to press in to the meaning of this week. I think you'd find a lot of good that can come out of that as God speaks to you and leads you. If you have your Bibles, turn to Mark chapter 15. Again, we're going to look at for whom did Jesus die? And I do want to start by just talking about for what reason did Jesus die? And we use this language about how Jesus died for us all the time. How many of you heard that? Jesus died for us. How many of you ever really thought about what that means? What does it mean that Jesus died for us, right? Because he didn't die for us in the sense or in the way that, there's this heroic person who rushes into a burning building to help save people, right? Or a person that goes to the front lines of battle to try to push back an advancing army, right? But in either of those cases, that person becomes an unfortunate victim of the danger that they put themselves in. Right? That's not the same exact sense in which Jesus died for us, nor did he die for us in the sense that he became an unfortunate martyr of a cause that he was advocating for, right? He was not involved in some cause, and that cause ultimately led to his untimely death. He didn't die for us in the sense that he was setting an example. Now we know that, he said something to the effect of that there's no greater love that one shows to another, but that a person lays down their life for someone else, right? And so we know that there is an example in the way that Jesus laid down his life, but that is not the reason why Jesus died was not to set an example. Hopefully, none of us have to follow that example, right? Jesus' mission was specifically to go to the cross. It was not an accident. It was not an unfortunate kind of misalignment of the stars that led to something that we wish had not taken place. No, Jesus' mission was specifically to go to the cross. He did not end up on the cross by accident, and that's important for us to keep in mind. That the chief reason why Jesus was crucified was not due to some terrible lapse in a lousy justice system. Jesus fixed himself on going to the cross. And somehow what he did on the cross accomplished something for us. This is why we use the language of Jesus died for us. What was that? In Isaiah chapter 53, read a couple of verses that give us a little bit of insight about what it is that Jesus died for. It says here, but he was pierced because of our rebellion, crushed because of our iniquities. Punishment for our peace was on him, and we are healed by his wounds. We all went astray like sheep. We all have turned to our own way, and the Lord has punished him for the iniquity of us all. I want to define a couple of terms that we find in those couple of verses in Isaiah. The first one is translated in the English, rebellion. Let me read it again. He was pierced because of our rebellion. The Hebrew word for rebellion here is pesha. And this word means or refers to something like a person recognizes who is in authority, but rebels exactly against that authority. That there's this purposeful decision to move in the opposite direction to spite the authority, right? So it's to claim that I am my own authority and I don't accept the other. In other words, rebellion means rebellion. How many of you have ever rebelled before? How many of you in the room, if you were honest, you have to admit, you just a tinge of the spirit of rebellion in you. How many of you are there? Okay, right. There's a rule that you find is kind of stupid. You are happy to at least bend it, if not break it. Am I right? Well, when it comes to what it is that we are expected in how we live our lives, right? There is for some an understanding that we are not our own authority, that there's an authority that exists outside of us, right? And that authority has a claim on what is right and what is wrong. Right? And so to rebel against that authority is to kind of throw off the restraints and to say, I'm going to do what I want to do. And so what we're told here in Isaiah is that he was pierced for that rebellion. He was bruised or crushed for our iniquities. Here's another word, iniquity. One of my favorite words in the English language. I mean, it just drips with iniquity, right? I mean, all right, maybe you don't feel the same way. So what are iniquities? The Hebrew word for iniquities is awan. And these are things that come about by twisting or distorting something from its original condition. This is what iniquity means. Right? It can be used to simply describe the warping or the twisting of something away from its original condition, but it's obviously used in Scripture a lot to describe what happens in the realm of morality and moral behavior. Right? That when talking about some kind of moral deviation, iniquity is something like taking what was intended to be good and then twisting it away or distorting it from its original condition. In fact, to the point where it often becomes an evil caricature of something that was meant to be good. Right? So there are these things that put the world wrong, right? Things like rebellion and like iniquity. Rebellion and iniquity puts the world wrong. A world that God created as good. But a world that has gone wrong because it has thrown off its authority and it has twisted and perverted what was originally good to prefer something else instead, what we're told is that the consequence for that is death. You see, death confirms who is actually in authority. Now, any person can, if they choose to, try to walk around this world and live their lives as if they are their own authority, right? And lots of people do that. Like most of them do. And we at times, I imagine, do as well. But death is this reminder, and it is this confirmation of how we are not ultimately our own authority. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that nobody, regardless of how much effort and intuition and intelligence they put into putting off their own death, death is ultimately going to come for every single one. None of us is in control of it, right? To the point where we can ultimately resist it. And so death reminds us, no, I'm not. As much as I might like to think I am not my own authority. Right? So we have this world that God created as good, right? But evil has come into the world, and evil has thrown off the restraints that the God of this world has created for the good of the world. Right? And the world has gone its own way. Furthermore, the world has taken so much of what God has created as good and has warped and twisted it into something else. And the result of that is death. And death is described in Scripture as the final enemy, right? That while death is a part of the condition of the world, God is in the process of taking or causing for his will for a good world that's gone bad, but that will be redeemed in the end to ultimately come to full fruition, right? And so this person that's being described in Isaiah has died for the purpose ultimately of defeating death, right? His death comes about, his suffering comes about because of the actions of others. So now let's ask, well, who are the us and the we and the our? Let me read it again. He was pierced because of our rebellion. Who's the our in here? He was crushed because of our iniquities. Punishment for our peace was on him. And we, who are the we who are healed by his wounds? We all went astray like sheep. We all have turned our own way. And the Lord has punished him for the iniquity of us all. Who are the us and the we and the our? Right? Because you might be saying, well, I didn't write that. I didn't write those words. Like, don't put that on me. Well, I think a lot of us understand that those verses that we read there, while they're spoken by the prophet Isaiah, they refer more broadly to just an individual or even a small company of individuals, but they speak universally of every single one of us. Right? Now, that can be a little hard to swallow for a lot of us because, again, if we were honest, most of us probably don't think we're bad enough to deserve anything like death. Never mind the kind of death that Jesus had to endure, right? Like, don't raise your hands, but how many of you, you would agree that like, how you've lived your life, the things that you have done, even the worst of things that you have done, while they may require some kind of discipline, they might require, some kind of like making restitution and making things right. You'd say, I don't know that I necessarily deserve to die because of that. Never mind die in the way that Jesus died. But that is a failure to actually acknowledge the gravity of our sin, right? That's not a problem with, if I could describe it this way, the ecosystem in which all of this stuff is being talked about, but it has to do with my lack of perspective on what my sin actually means and what my sin actually weighs, right? And again, like death is the reminder of exactly the problem we are all facing. Death in the sense that we lose things that die. How many of you have lost things that have died? Or we lose people we love to death. We are, every single one of us, heading towards our own death. And again, this is why Paul put it this way in his letter to the Corinthians. He said that the final enemy to be defeated is death. So, again, we come back to the original question, for whom did Jesus die? And for whom did his death serve as a substitute? Because the cross was an act of substitution for what someone else deserved. This is what Isaiah is telling us. The cross was an act of substitution for what someone else deserved. Who are the someone else's? Turn to Mark chapter 15. We're going to go through this chapter, and we're going to look at the types of people for whom Jesus died as we are reading through the story of his death. Mark chapter 15, starting in verse 1. As soon as it was morning, having held a meeting with the elders, scribes, and the whole Sanhedrin, you remember Jesus was arrested by a religious group of leaders who they had no authority to do what they ultimately wanted done to Jesus. They couldn't do that. They couldn't kill Jesus themselves. They didn't possess the authority to do that. They were subjects of the empire of Rome. And if there was going to be a capital punishment executed on a person, there was going to have to be a permission given by Rome itself, right? And so in the morning, following that whole thing we talked about last week, where Jesus stood before the high priest and the chief priest and all of these who were bringing these accusations against him for religious reasons, it says they tied Jesus up, they led him away, and they handed him over to Pilate. Pilate is the Roman official, right? He is the one who is going to give the say-so for Jesus' execution if he determines that that is appropriate. So Pilate begins his own inquisition of Jesus. And he asked him, "Are you king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered him, "You say so." And the chief priests accused him of many things, right? They're all there. Again, making their case to Pilate against Jesus. And so Pilate questioned him again. "Aren't you going to answer? Look how many things they are accusing you of," right? Accusation after accusation just keeps on coming, peppering Jesus with all of these things for which they have determined he is guilty and for which they are hoping that Pilate will punish him. But Jesus still did not answer, and so Pilate was amazed. At the festival, I remember we're at this time of Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? So this is a time of festival under normal, ordinary circumstances. And at this time of the year, Pilate used to release for the people a prisoner whom they requested. And there was one named Barabbas who was in prison with rebels who had committed murder during the rebellion, right? And so there was this political uprising and rebellion. Barabbas was one of the participants of that, but it was squashed by the authority of Rome. And now Barabbas is just languishing there in prison, awaiting his own death sentence, right? And so Mark points out that there is this person, and the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do for them what as was his custom, right? So you have Jesus there before Pilate with all of the people that are making the accusations against him, and you also have, this contingent of people who are at the same time coming to Pilate to ask him to do what he normally does at this time of every year. And Pilate sees this as a potential opportunity. And so he answered them, all right, well, do you want for me to release the king of the Jews for you? For he knew that it was because of envy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd so that he would release Barabbas to them instead. And Pilate asked them again, then what do you want me to do with the one you call the king of the Jews? And again they shouted, crucify him. Pilate said to them, why? What has he done wrong? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. And wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. And after having Jesus flogged, he handed him over to be crucified. The first person that I want to talk about for whom Jesus died is the person Pontius Pilate. This is the first person for whom Jesus died. And Pontius Pilate represents people who recognize truth but refuse to act on it. Right? Pilate is in this position of authority. Like, he could listen to all of the accusations that come up against Jesus, and he can make, if he is willing to do so, he can make the decision for Jesus to be released, to go free. And we're given some insight into what's going on in the mind of Pilate, where it's clear he doesn't agree that Jesus has done anything worthy of being executed. And yet he chooses to allow it to move forward. Right? He recognizes the truth, but he refuses to act on it. This represents people who choose convenience, who choose career, who choose public approval over justice, over what is actually right. Right? This is the person who knows what is right but lacks the courage to act on it. He or she is swayed by crowds and their own personal convenience. Right? This willingness to kind of look the other way so as not to have to be inconvenienced to do what is right. So who does Jesus die for? Jesus dies for the cowardly. He dies for those who choose things like influence over justice. People who wash their hands of responsibility when it is in the power of their hands to do otherwise. In other words, Jesus dies for those who know better but fail to do better. So I ask you this morning, who do you know as a person who prefers convenience over doing what is right and what is often much harder to do? Or maybe I can ask you, are you that person for whom Jesus died? Another set of characters that we see here in this part of the story is this crowd, right? This crowd that has been motivated to cry out for Jesus to be crucified, right? This crowd that was manipulated by a small group of loud voices. Right? They represent the tendency that people have to conform to what is socially acceptable at any particular given time. Right? These are people who are easily swayed by culture rather than grounded in reality. What is the reality? Well, the reality is that Jesus is innocent of all of the charges. The reality is that Jesus does not deserve to die on the cross. But they are swayed by this movement in culture rather than grounded in and convicted by that reality. These are people who are, they're easily moved by things like fear, right? Fear causes them to choose otherwise from what they ought to. They're moved by culture. They're moved by influence and influencers. They're fickle. They're driven by emotion. They're driven by peer pressure. They often find themselves lost in something like a mob mentality, right? And so we might not see mobs gathering in the streets, like we might have 100 years ago or 150 years ago. But how many of you know that these kinds of things happen in our online lives all the time? Right? How many of you have seen the mob mentality at work? Right? Somebody says something maybe that's a little bit off or that is not in step with what has become socially acceptable, and everybody decides to pile on, right? Because it's easy to do so. And so who does Jesus die for? He dies for those who go along and even support another's wrongdoing. So let me ask you, who do you know is a person who is easily swayed by the tides of culture, tossed by the winds of cultural change? Or are you that person for whom Jesus died? A third one here is the guilty criminal, Barabbas, right? And Barabbas, he's an interesting category of people because he falls in the category of the obvious sinner. I mean, you know that there's people in the world who they obviously deserve what's coming to them, right? They're clearly guilty. They're clearly rebellious. They're clearly undeserving of another chance, right? Barabbas represents those whose freedom come at Jesus' expense. And so we're given a hint at the substitutionary nature of Jesus. It's Barabbas that deserved to hang on the cross, and yet it was Jesus who did so. Barabbas is literally set free because Jesus takes his place. And so Jesus dies for the criminal. He dies for the rebel. He dies for the person who is openly guilty and deserving of punishment. Who do you know is a person who clearly deserves what they have coming to them? Have you done something deserving God's punishment? The good news of the gospel, of course, is that the cross covers that cost. And if we'll have it, it sets us free from the guilt of our past, regardless of how far we may have gone. Barabbas was not beyond the reach of what Jesus accomplished. And so neither can any one of us in this room this morning. We read on. The soldiers led him away into the palace, that is the governor's residence, and called the whole company together. They dressed him in a purple robe, twisted together a crown of thorns, and put it on him. And they began to salute him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They were hitting him on the head with a stick and spitting on him. Getting down on their knees, they were paying him homage. After they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple robe and put his clothes on him. And so we have here another group of people for whom Jesus died. They are the mocking soldiers. These people who were guilty of an incredible kind of hardness and cruelty. They represent those who they ridicule, they abuse, and they are indifferent to the suffering of others. They are people who are often hardened by power, hardened by violence, hardened by cynicism. The soldiers, as we read about them here in the story, they're indifferent to the man that they are torturing and executing. They treat him like an object for sport and duty. So who does Jesus die for? He died for those who are hardened by their work, who inflict pain without remorse, and who are spiritually numb to the suffering of other people. Who do you know is a person who has been hardened by their own circumstances, who has become immune to the suffering of others? Are you that person for whom Jesus died? They led him out to crucify him. They forced a man coming in from the country who was passing by to carry Jesus' cross. He was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Then they crucified him and divided his clothes, casting lots for them to decide what each would get. Now, it was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. We're introduced here to Simon, this person, a member of the crowd, who was given the responsibility of carrying Jesus' cross, which he was supposed to, but could no longer carry himself. And so Simon represents for us the reluctant participant. He is the kind of person who is pulled into the story of Jesus unexpectedly. And so the idea here is that Jesus dies for those who didn't seek him first. Simon wasn't seeking out Jesus. He wasn't looking for Jesus, and yet he was pulled in. And he is a reminder to us that God does not love us because we loved him first, but rather that he loved us first. In that while we were still sinners, Christ died for the ungodly. It wasn't because we had prettied ourselves up and made us ready and presentable for a holy God, but rather in the very condition in which we were found, Jesus reached down and pulled us to himself. So who do you know as a person who God seems to be pulling in even despite their reluctance? Are you that person? We have the soldiers again taking Jesus' robe and ripping his clothes and then casting lots to see who gets what. And here the soldiers represent those who trivialize what is holy, right? They are people who are more concerned with the material world than they are with what is truly and spiritually real. And so Jesus here, we are told, he dies for those who don't take him seriously. Who do you know as a person who doesn't give any serious thought to the claims of Christianity? The idea that we are ultimately accountable with how and in what direction we live our lives. And are you that person? So the inscription of the charge written against him was, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 criminals with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by were yelling insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ha! The one who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself by coming down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests with the scribes were mocking him and among themselves and saying, "Well, he saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross so that we may see and believe." Even those who were crucified with him taunted him. We have here the chief priests, the scribes, the elders. And they represent religious and spiritual people who claimed their own truth but rejected the truth. And by the truth, I do not mean Paul Pierce, former player for the Boston Celtics, for those of you who don't know. The truth, as in Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life. They have rejected the truth for their own truth. Right? These are people who, they are outwardly moral, they are outwardly religious, but inwardly they are resistant to the truth. They reject Jesus in order to protect their own power, their own status, all of the traditions that they had come to love more than what those traditions ultimately pointed to. They represent those who are religious but who have lost their way. They're the self-righteous. They are the legalistic. They are those who use religion in order to maintain power and control rather than to seek and to help other people seek God. So who does Jesus die for? Jesus dies for the religious hypocrite who values tradition over truth and is willing even to condemn the innocent in order to protect their own institution. And so Jesus here, he dies even for those who think they don't need him. Who do you know is a person who has made some religious commitments but have lost their way? Are you that person? We have the insulting criminal, the criminals that were crucified on either side of Jesus, who also participated in mocking him. They represent the people who reject Jesus despite their own personal desperation, right? These are people whose their hearts are hardened to the very end. And the idea here is that Jesus dies even for those who continue rejecting him. Of course, we know that one of them, at some point, changed his mind about who Jesus is. Who do you know as a person who is experiencing their own desperate and hopeless circumstances, but who persist in rejecting the invitation that Jesus gives? Maybe even uses their circumstances as an excuse not to believe in God. Are you that person for whom Jesus died? Will you persist as the one thief who died alone, or the other in the company of Jesus? All right, we're almost there. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you abandoned me? When some of those standing there heard this, they said, see, he's calling for Elijah. Someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, fixed it on a stick, and offered him a drink and said, let's see if Elijah comes to take him down. And Jesus let out a loud cry and breathed his last. Then the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the centurion who was standing opposite him saw the way he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. We'll come back to him at the end. There were also women watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women followed him and took care of him. Many other women had come up with him to Jerusalem. And here we find some followers who are observing what's going on with Jesus from a distance. Specifically, 3 women that are named here. And they represent the faithful who are but overwhelmed by grief, despair, and helplessness. Right? These are the ones that Mark points out followed and served Jesus in his life, but now can only watch in sorrow at his death. They feel powerless. And so Jesus dies for the faithful, but who are broken by suffering and who feel abandoned in their darkest hour. For those who remain loyal but feel powerless or afraid. Right? That Jesus dies for those who love him but feel weak. So who do you know as a person who is faithful to Jesus but has become overwhelmed and broken? Are you that person for whom Jesus died? When it was already evening, because it was the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the Sanhedrin who was himself looking forward to the kingdom of God, came and boldly went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. This is Joseph, a member of great influence in the very council that participated in the accusations that ultimately led to Jesus' execution. Joseph, I think, can represent for us people who will come forward even after the cost of following becomes clear. These are people who move from maybe a place of secrecy to courage. We don't know in what way and to what degree Joseph participated in all of what this council ultimately did to Jesus. Was he an outspoken critic? Was he a silent observer? Was he one who went along with the crowd for a while but now felt differently? We don't know. What we do know is that after the fact, he came forward when the cost of following Jesus became clear. So who does Jesus die for? He dies for those who step forward even when it's late. Pilate was surprised that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had already died. When he found out from the centurion, he gave the corpse to Joseph. After he bought some linen cloth, Joseph took him down and wrapped him in the linen, and then he laid him in a tomb cut out of the rock and rolled a stone against the entrance to the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, were watching where he was laid. And that ends our chapter. And so let me conclude with one final character, and that is, again, the centurion. I introduced the centurion to you 30 weeks ago, 30 Sundays ago, when we started on this little venture of reading through the Gospel of Mark. Because Mark began his gospel in this way. He said, "The gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." And we don't hear such a thing again until now, when Jesus has breathed his last, and one who participated in his execution, who observes the way in which Jesus breathed his last breath, makes this confession, where he says, "Surely this was the Son of God." The Roman centurion represents people who seem least likely to receive Jesus for who he is. These are the outsiders, the skeptics, the people who are spiritually distant, but that come to faith when they witness for themselves what is true. It's funny because he's, for all practical purposes, he's not really in any position to embrace Jesus as Messiah like the nation of Israel was. He is, after all, he's a Gentile. He's a soldier that belongs to this squadron of people that are executing Jesus. Likely he was involved in the crucifixion itself, and yet he becomes the first human in Mark's gospel to clearly declare that Jesus is the Son of God, and he does this at the cross. And Mark points this out for it to be, I think, both ironic and intentional, right? What have we seen? Well, we've seen religious leaders who have rejected Jesus. We've seen the disciples of Jesus who have fled from Jesus. We have seen the hardened outsider, this Roman centurion, who now sees clearly. You know what that tells me? It tells me that, and many of you have experienced this. Maybe there's someone in here who is yet to experience this. But the reality is you can start from very, 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 very far away and end up seeing very, very clearly what is true. That we can encounter God in ways that we have not ever expected. I bet you there are hundreds and hundreds of stories in this room of people who have encountered God over the course of their lives in unexpected ways. We're reminded here that in the very moment where it seems like it's too late, anyone can still come to faith and believe in Jesus as the Son of God.